You know what the Sahara looks like? Endless dunes, cracked earth, nothing living for hundreds of miles in any direction. The largest hot desert on Earth, roughly the size of the United States. It's the definition of empty. Now here's the strange part. Deep inside that desert, on rock walls hundreds of miles from the nearest permanent water, there are paintings of people swimming. The real answer is far stranger than a mistake or a myth. Those paintings are accurate. The Sahara was green, people lived there, and it happened recently enough that it's essentially yesterday in human terms. Think about what that actually requires. Not a slightly wetter desert. A landscape with lakes, rivers, grassland, hippos, crocodiles, elephants, and enough water for people to swim in a region that today receives almost no rainfall at all. And this wasn't millions of years ago. The most recent green phase ended roughly 5,000 years ago, which means it overlapped with the building of the Egyptian pyramids. To understand how this is possible, you have to look at something most people never think about. The Earth wobbles. The planet doesn't spin perfectly upright and steady. Its axis tilts, and that tilt slowly shifts over time, along with the shape of its orbit and the direction the axis points. These are called Milankovitch cycles, named after the Serbian scientist Milutin Milankovic, who worked out the mathematics of how they affect climate. They operate on timescales of tens of thousands of years, and they change how much sunlight reaches different parts of the planet at different times of year. Around 15,000 years ago, one of these shifts increased summer sunlight across the northern hemisphere. That extra heat strengthened the West African monsoon, dragging rain far further north than it reaches today. Climate scientists studying this period have found that the monsoon rain belt shifted hundreds of miles northward, watering an area that is now among the driest places on the planet. What appeared afterward is sometimes called the African humid period, or simply the Green Sahara, and the evidence for it is overwhelming. Satellite radar imaging has revealed enormous river channels buried under the sand, entire drainage networks feeding lakes that no longer exist. One of them, Lake Megachad, at its peak covered an area larger than the modern Caspian Sea. Sediment cores drilled from the ocean floor off West Africa show dramatically less wind-blown dust during this period, exactly what you'd expect if vegetation was holding the soil in place instead of sand blowing freely. Then there are the paintings themselves. In the Gilf Kabir Plateau on the Egypt-Libya border, a site called the Cave of Swimmers contains rock art of human figures in postures that appear to show swimming, discovered by Hungarian explorer Laszlo Almasi in 1933. Across the wider Sahara, at sites like Tassili Nadja in Algeria, thousands of paintings and engravings show cattle herds, giraffes, elephants, hippos, and people fishing, dancing, and living ordinary lives. Archaeologist Savino Di Lernia, who has excavated Saharan sites for decades, has documented evidence of people herding cattle in the central Sahara thousands of years ago, including chemical residues in ancient pottery indicating dairy processing. Not people passing through, people settled, keeping animals and making cheese in what is now open desert. Ask yourself what that means for how you picture the region. The Sahara isn't a permanent feature that has always been there. It's a state the region enters and leaves repeatedly, on a cycle. Sediment records suggest this has happened many times, with green phases recurring roughly every 20,000 years, driven by the same orbital rhythm. And then, around 5,000 years ago, it ended. The orbital conditions shifted again. Summer sunlight in the northern hemisphere decreased, the monsoon retreated south, and the region dried out. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Research into this transition suggests it may not have been a smooth, gradual fade. Some evidence points toward the change happening relatively abruptly in certain regions, as vegetation loss reduced moisture recycling, which reduced rainfall further, which killed more vegetation. A feedback loop that can tip a landscape from grassland to desert far faster than the underlying orbital change alone would suggest. The people living there had to leave. Many archaeologists have argued that this drying pushed populations toward the one reliable water source remaining in the region, the Nile Valley, concentrating people along a narrow strip of fertile land. The timing of that concentration sits close to the emergence of a unified Egyptian state. So the civilization you think of as the ultimate symbol of the desert may have been shaped in part by refugees from a landscape that was drying out behind them. This is what should stay with you. There are paintings of swimmers, hundreds of miles into the largest hot desert on Earth, made by people who live there, in a world that no longer exists. Nothing about the Sahara being a desert is permanent or inevitable. It's a phase tied to the tilt of a planet, and it has ended before. So the next time you picture the Sahara, remember what's actually underneath it. Riverbeds, lake beds, cattle bones, pottery with milk residue still detectable in the clay. And remember what the sediment records show about the cycle itself, that this region has greened and dried many times before, driven by the slow tilt of a planet that hasn't stopped moving. The desert you picture as permanent is a phase. It has ended before, and the orbital rhythm that ended it is still running.